Hey Gearheads. In this lesson, we're going to talk about scouting a location. We're going to talk about how planning on what lights you're going to bring to your scene, how to get the scene lit, and how to try to fit it within that 5-stop range that we had talked about earlier. But first, I wanted to talk about that as a filmmaker, I always seem to be at war with Murphy's Law. And Murphy and I have found a way to get along so far on this series of tutorials, but in this particular series, as you'll see later, Murphy decided that he wanted to have a battle, and as always, unless you come prepared, which I didn't, Murphy will win that. So what I wanted to do in this lesson is I wanted to test shooting an 11-stop range, a 7-stop range, and a 5-stop range, just to show you the difference of what kind of flexibility you have in post, and what you can and can't get away with the camera in terms of what you can actually fit into the dynamic range of the camera. So in this case, this is the same basic setup we used for the tutorial that I'm sitting in now. The only difference is the fill light has died. And now I'm stuck with just a reflector out this window, which is reading, let's see, 12 1/3. A scene out the window that is 13 2/3. A rim light of 10 1/3, and a ambient fill of 9 1/3. No, I can't be wrong. I've got to block it. Hang on. 8 2/3. So this should fit. This should fit within the dynamic range of the camera pretty well. It's going to be a little high contrast because I don't have a fill light. But as you'll see in the scene, I tried to set it up to give us something that's a little more even, a little flat, but something that we can use a 4:1 ratio that we can use in post and do some pretty creative things color-wise. So, but the first thing we're going to talk about is scouting a location. So let's go ahead and get into that. So this is our location here. What normally happens on a location scout is you go through quite a number of different things, and depending on the director you're working with and the production and how much money you have or don't have, it could be the experience you might have on that could vary quite a bit. But in this particular case, if you have a really good director, the director will walk in and say, okay, this is our space, this is scene 7 in our shoot. This is the scene where what's-her-name tells her friend about the thing and whatever. So what's going to happen is she's going to be sitting here. She's going to be looking out, contemplatively, sort of, going through her emotional scheme. Her friend comes in and sits down. She does the scene between her and the friend. We're going to shoot coverage. We're going to shoot from that direction over this way. We're going to do coverage on the friend, and then we'll do a dolly master, very slow dolly master from over on that side of the room. Very slow, back and forth, just something to cut away to kind of give some energy to the scene. As far as I know, all of this will be here practically when we shoot. Okay, so that's a good director. That's a director who's really done his homework. You're not always going to get that. Sometimes you're going to get a director who's going to walk in. Art department's not going to be on set. Your line producer's not going to be on set. They're not going to know anything about the space. You're going to walk in, and sometimes, depending on the space that you're shooting in, if it's a live set, you could walk in, there could be a bunch of gear staged, as well as other props and stuff like that. So you don't know what's actually going to be in the space. So one of the things you want to find out is what's actually going to be here day of. Is this the furniture you're going to have? Are these the drapes you're going to have? Is this the state that the windows are going to be in? Are these the practical light sources you're going to have? These are questions that you want to ask when you're on set, when you're scouting. So that's usually taken care of in the tech scout, but sometimes if you're on a really low budget, your location scout and your tech scout are going to happen at the same time. Okay, so after you've done your walkthrough and you understand the space, you understand all of the logistical stuff, then you want to meter your scene. You want to know what kind of light you're going to need to bring. So having your light meter, it's usually, I always bring mine, my gaffer always brings his, so there's at least 2 meters running around on set. So I want to look at this, I want to say, okay, my character is going to be like right here. So I want to meter how much ambient light is coming through this window. And I've got 10 2/3 EVs. But I also have metered this, and I know that this time of day, right now we're before noon. And I know I would have asked, what time of day are we shooting this? Where on the schedule is it going to be? And I know that at noon and a little bit after noon, I'm gonna have a lot more light outside this window than I have right now. And I've already metered it before now to test, and it's gonna be around 11 EVs coming through the window. And then I wanna take my incident meter off, and I wanna meter my scene outside the window. I can meter that, and it says 15 2/3, which is pretty close to what I would get outside right now. If I were to actually go out and stick this in the sun and do an incident reading of the light of the sunlight right now, I get about 15 2/3 to 16 EVs. So now I've got a gap of, let's just call it 16 and 11 at noontime or 1 o'clock when we're going to be shooting this. So that's a gap of 4 stops. That's a 5-stop dynamic range between what I'm going to have on my character versus the outside window. And this is why a lot of times these scenes blow out. When you're shooting on a DSLR and you don't have enough power with your lights, or you don't have neutral density gels to knock that light down, you end up losing all of your detail out the window. And one of the things we're going to cover in this is how to combat that. So the other thing I want to read is I want to read how much ambient light is in the room. Now this is going to get thrown off by the fact that there's a light on top of the camera. So I'm going to have Collier go ahead and turn the light off the camera, so I can meter the ambient light that I have reflecting off of what's coming through the window back into here. And it's 7. So between 7 and 16 is a gap of 9. I know on noonday sun, I'm going to have a reading of about 6 coming from in here. So between 6 and 16 is a difference of 10 stops, which is an 11-stop dynamic range. And the way that we get that number, in case you're confused, is, you can go ahead and turn the light back on. The way that we come to that is it's a difference of 10 stops, but you have to count every single stop. So if we were to just count it out on our fingers, we would say 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. It's 11 stops, but it's a difference of 10. But you would call that, in terminology, you would call that an 11-stop dynamic range for your scene. Well, if we have a DSLR that's only got, let's say, 9 2/3 or a 10-stop full dynamic range, we can't fit this scene into the dynamic range of our camera. Not only that, but because we have a difference between 16 and 11 between the outside scene and the ambient light I have coming through this window, when I get perfect exposure on our subject's face from the ambient light coming through the window, now I've got a difference of, 5 stops between that exposure and my outdoors. And most DSLRs only have about 3 stops, +1, +2, +3 on your in-camera meter before you blow out to white, which means I can't fit this. Even if I ignore everything that's coming from in here and just try and expose on the light that's coming through the window, I still can't fit all of that in. So what do I do? And that's the next stage. That's what we look at. We start going, okay, what do we need to be able to conform this scene to fit our cameras on our budget? Okay, so here's our scene. And as we talked about, we have 16 EV out here, 11 coming in through the window, and 6 EV washing back from the room from the light that's coming in through this window. So there's light coming in through this window, hitting the floor and the wall, and then washing back on our subject, but it's only reading around 6 EV. So we've got an 11-stop scene. We've got 11-stop range, a difference of 10 stops. So our camera's going to be set here, and I know that if I'm going to do this wide dolly shot that I want to do, I've got to get my light and my diffuser back about 10 feet here. So if I got to be 10 feet away here, and I know I can stick probably a 650 over here just out of frame, and it's only be about 5 feet away, how do I determine what lights do I need for this scene? Or at least how much lights do I need for the long throw, for the long throw light? Well, there's a couple of ways we can do it. There's an app actually called BeamCalc, and BeamCalc lets you take and you go in and basically here's what it looks like. You can go in and you can select your sources. You can set it in this case for an RE, Fresnel. You set it to the 2K. Set to wide. There's wide and narrow, or wide and tight setting. But the wide is full flood. The narrow is, or tight is spot. And it will tell you. You just plug that in, and then you tell it how far away it's going to be. In this particular case, you can choose the height of your subject, the height of the light, and then the distance, sort of an X and Y coordinate kind of thing. And then it'll tell you the exact throw distance with that particular setting and how many foot candles you'll get. In this particular case, we're getting 304 according to the application, which I can come over here to, and that's at full flood. I can get between 10 to 10.5 EVs at ISO 100, but I'm shooting at ISO 200, so that 10 to 10.5 becomes 11 to 11.5. So that means without any gels, without any diffusion, I can actually bring the light in the room up to match the light coming in through the window. But my light on my 2K is going to be tungsten. So in this particular case, with a tungsten light, I'm going to have to gel this to get it closer to sunlight, which is quite a bit bluer in the spectrum. So if I add, if we go back to our cheat sheet here, I can see that with CTB gel, I'm going to lose a stop and a third. If I go 250 diffusion, I'm going to lose yet another stop and a third. So I'm losing almost 3 stops off of what I'm getting from my 2K at full flood. That's not really ideal for what I want to do. So in this particular case, with a 2K, there's some more information that I need to know. So it's also helpful to understand the inverse square law a little bit, because with the inverse square law, what you can do is right here on the RE specifications, on the documentation that comes with the light, there's this photometric data, and if your light should have this. If not, I don't know what to tell you, but it's pretty standard. All light manufacturers are a little bit different, but this can at least get you in the ballpark. And in this particular case, they'll actually tell you with full spot, with medium focus, which is splitting the difference between spot and flood, and with flood at 15 feet, 20 feet, how many foot candles you're going to get with that light. Or for a custom, at any distance, all you need to do is take this number that they give you for spot, medium, and full flood, and then divide it by the distance squared. So in this particular case, it would be 10 feet. We square 10 feet and we get 100. That's 10 times 10. That's how you square a number, in case you haven't been to school in a while and you forgot how. And you divide 100 into this number, which is as simple as just taking the decimal point and moving it over 2 places, and we get 304.25 or 722 at medium. So I'm like going, well, wait a minute, 722 is going to put me at between 11 and 11.5 at ISO 100, which will put me between 12 and 12.5 at ISO 200, which is kind of where I really want to be with a 2K. Then if I go with 202 gel instead of 201, which will be a little bit warmer, but still not quite as warm as tungsten, and then some specialized diffusion, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I know that 202 is only going to lose 2/3 of a stop, and my specialized diffusion is only going to lose 1/3 of a stop. So now I'm only losing a stop over what I had. So what I gain in shooting ISO 200 over ISO 100, the stop that I gain, I am only knocking it down by that one stop here. So the stop that I lose, I'm gaining back by shooting at ISO 200. So whatever my 722 that it says over here gets me between 11.5 and 12, that's going to work. Between 11.5 and 12, that's definitely going to be workable. I can adjust that. I can scrim it. I can flood it out a little bit and diffuse it, back it up maybe a little bit, and still get something that I can use as a fill light in this particular area. So a 2K, I just determined that a 2K will be fine for my uses as far as bringing the light up in this room in terms of a fill light. And then I can use the same calculations for my 650. I'm putting a 250 watt bulb on a dimmer in this practical light, so that if the shot goes wide enough, here, let's go ahead and bring up the frame. So if the shot does go wide enough, in this particular case it didn't, but if it did, you would have seen a light here. And in this case, the light was off. All the lights were off inside the room. But in the other shot, or the other version of this shot, in this particular case, the lights are on. You can see this hair light here. This light, also there's a light lighting up the curtains back here. And if I'd come wider, we would have seen a practical lamp sitting over here that would have motivated this light that was coming onto her and on her shirt here and here on the couch and everywhere like that. Anyway, that's a discussion for a little bit later. But I know that I've got all my light situation figured out for this particular room, as far as bringing it up to match what I've got here. But now I've still got a problem. I've got a problem and it's this 5 EV difference between that we just talked about earlier between here and here. How do I now bring this down or bring this up to match that? Well, I can put a reflector out here. So let's go ahead and actually let's take a look at what we would get with neutral density. If we were to use a neutral density gel on the window, I'd be able to bring the effective exposure down to 13 outside, my outside scene down to 13, and the light coming through the window down to 8. So between 13 and 6 is a difference of 7 stops. That's an 8-stop range. Now, almost every DSLR will fit that, so I don't even need, well, I do need lights, but in this particular case, without even bringing in any lights, which is what this scene is, there's no lights in this scene. I've just got neutral density gels on the window. I've managed to squeeze this into the range of my DSLR just by gelling the windows. Of course, now I wanted to get her skin tone up a little higher, so I put a reflector outside this window, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So my setup ends up being this right here. I brought the outdoor scene down by 3 stops by gelling the window, which also effectively brought down the light coming through this window to light my subject. So I put a reflector outside the window, which gave me about 12, I think between 12 and 2/3 and 13 stops here. So I was almost even with my scene out here, and I think I was able to tweak that a little bit. Got the 2K in here with the diffusion, 650 here, and then a practical lamp. So this is the actual lighting setup for the scene. And you're probably going, okay, wait, neutral density gels, you just blew my mind. You just skipped a stage that I don't know anything about. I've never used neutral density gels. I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. A lot of times what happens is the director or the producer hears the cost of the gels and immediately says no. Like, no, that's too expensive. $120 for a roll of neutral density gel that we're only going to use once. That's what everybody says, we're only going to use once. Guess what? You never just use it once. If you're shooting a feature film or you're shooting a short film, and if you're going to be shooting even more films after that, you're not going to use it just once. But let's sort of weigh the cost of using a neutral density gel versus having to rent a generator. So $120 for a roll of neutral density gels. And in this particular case, let's look at the shot again. I only need to cover this window and this window. So it's about 30, this window's 30 inches wide, and it's 4 feet tall. Naturally, you kind of go, wow, that's interesting. The neutral density rolls are 4 feet wide by 25 feet long. So if I cut off a little 30-inch slice, I can cover this entire window, and I've still got 22.5 feet left on my roll that I can use on other windows, I can use in other shoots down the road. And I can reuse this stuff. As long as it doesn't get, terribly scratched or terribly dirty, I can reuse it. So in this particular case, on this shoot, of my 25-foot roll, I only cut off a 30-inch slice, 30-inch by 4-foot slice, cut that in half, and gelled both of these windows. I left the window back here and the window here ungelled so that the light, so if we were looking at the overhead, so that the light coming in through this half of the window would still strike my subject, and I could pull back the curtains a little bit and let the light coming in splash up against this wall back here and bring up the exposure there. And that's how this scene was lit. It was nothing but neutral density gels, and of course I added a reflector outside this window to bring up the exposure on her face a little bit more. And you can actually see the reflection of that in her eyes. And of course we talked about that in the scene. But let's say you don't want to use neutral density gels. Let's say you just want to use lights. Well, in this particular case, with a reflector, now I could have walked it in. Let's take a look at the reflector. Let's get rid of this. And I have the reflector set out here. It's probably about, I would guess, between 8 and 10 feet away from my subject. And it's bringing my exposure up to around 12 and 2/3 stops, I believe. Now I could have put it closer and gotten it up to 14, which would have worked. But between 16 and 14, I actually could have fit that exposure in. I wouldn't have been able to bring my room up with a 2K quite enough to be able to get this to work, but I definitely would have been able to squeeze my exposure of my subject and my outdoors within an acceptable range. The only problem with that is when you get a reflector that close to your subject, it's really hard not to get it in their eye line, and especially if they're going to be looking out the window, they're just going to get blinded, and you really don't want to do that to your actors, because number one, they're not going to like you very much, and number two, they're going to be stumbling around the set and knocking into things, which is not going to be very conducive to having an effective film shoot. So I couldn't put the reflector that close. I had to put it further away, and I had to change the angle of it so that it wasn't directly in her eye line, and that limited me to a different exposure. So I could have done it if I had a 5K HMI. I could have put it out there with some diffusion and lit this scene. I could have brought a 4K HMI inside and brought up my scene, not used neutral density gels at all, and we would have been perfectly fine. But to run a 4K and a 5K, you need a generator. House power is pretty much limited to about 2200 to 2300 watts, which is, you know, your 2K. Your 2K is about all that's going to fit on a house circuit. So if you decide that you don't want to use gels, I mean, let's calculate the cost of using a generator. How much is it going to cost to rent a generator? It's typically between $250 and $500. You also need a gaffer to run it, or an electrician, or both. Usually they're one and the same, and a qualified gaffer is going to cost you some money. They're not going to come work for free, especially if they're working on a generator. They're going to know how to balance that thing out, how to run power, how to run the distro, how to basically just completely run the set. You're going to need fuel for the generator. It's going to have to be delivered. You're going to need insurance to cover the cost of the generator, because otherwise they're not going to let you rent one. So now your cost for your low budget shoot has now skyrocketed astronomically. Whereas if you'd spend $120 on a roll of gels, you'd have this set up right here. And if you'd gotten neutral density CTO gels, which are a little bit different than neutral density gels, you wouldn't even need to gel the lights on the inside, because it would take the light coming in from the outside and conform it from sunlight to tungsten. So you would have tungsten light now coming through your windows, knocked down by 3 stops. And you could just use, you could just pull all the blue gels off of your lights and just use them as tungsten lights, and you'd be just perfectly fine. So those are the things that you need to consider. Let's go ahead and look at the power situation, and then come back in here and take a look at our scene. Okay, so here we are at the fuse box. If you look at these really closely, you can see there's different numbers on here. Most of these are labeled with a 20. Very few are with a 30 and a 50. There's a 50 around here somewhere. 30, 50 right there. Mostly you're not going to have access to the 30s and 50s. These are for like your washing machine, your furnace, air conditioner, that sort of thing. Most of the stuff with your outlets are going to have a 20 amp marker on them. And what that 20 means, the way you calculate that out, in the UK, I don't know how to figure it out because I've never been to the UK. I don't know how their stuff is labeled. But here in the United States, you either have 115 volts or 110. Most common is 110. So you multiply 110 volts by 20 amps, and you get 220 watts. So if you have a 2000 watt or a 2K light, you can fit that on one 20 amp circuit. So you can see that this one right here is tripped, this number 31. I found out that there's actually nothing plugged into this circuit. So we're going to plug our 2K into that circuit right there. But normally what would happen is you'd have a confab with your gaffer. You'd have walkie-talkies or radios, or you'd be on your phone. And you'd come out here and you'd start throwing switches, trying to figure out where the power is and how it's arranged in the house. Sometimes it's labeled like this, but even when it's labeled, it's still not clear, because the person who labeled it in terms that only they can understand, and that's sometimes a problem. So you want to figure out how to isolate your circuit. So if you have a 2K, if you're going to be running a 2K, you get that on its circuit by itself with nothing else plugged into it, and then make sure that when you got 650, if you got a 650 and a 500, that's going to get you up to what, 1150. You know, and you might have a bunch of other stuff plugged into that circuit, so you might actually trip the circuit. So you do have to kind of manage that. If you have a qualified gaffer, they'll be able to help you with this. But for those of us who don't always have a gaffer on set or to help us out, it's good to know this. We'll go over it more. I'll put up a chart so you can figure it out. But right now, we're going to put our 2K on that circuit. We're going to put everything else on different circuits, and we should be fine. We're not going to blow any fuses, although my 2K does have a tendency to blow a fuse even if it is isolated. And I think that's just because I have a crappy 2K. But yeah, so that's it. So you multiply 20 by 110, you get 2200 watts. That should be able to handle 2000 watts pretty easily. And the other thing that you'll do with your gaffer is you'll have a confab, and you'll talk about how you're going to run power. If you need to run power, like say I've got an outlet right here, and let's say I determined that this is the outlet that I needed to run my 2K off of. I would have to figure out how many feet of stingers or extension cords I would need to be able to run power all the way back here to power that one light. So that's the other thing you want to try and keep in your head and understand that when you're planning, you have to lay all that stuff out, because if you get here day of and you don't have all this planned out, it could kill your time. You could lose 30 minutes, an hour trying to send somebody out to get more stingers because you didn't get enough. You don't have enough to run your power the length that you need to run it. If you've got a generator, where's the generator going to sit? Is it going to sit along the house here? And are we going to run it in through a window somewhere? Or do we have to sit it, for sound reasons, do we have to sit it all the way at the back of the property and then run stingers all the way out to that to be able to run power, or not stingers, we'd run cam lock and some other different kind of power that I'll go into later, into the house to distro boxes, and the distro boxes would run your actual Edison power. And Edison, for those of you who don't know, an Edison plug is these little oh no plugs with the eyes and the big open mouth. That's kind of it for this. And then we'll move on. In the next tutorial, we'll talk a little bit about how to set up this scene and how to go about compressing this scene into the dynamic range that we want to use.